The only sound in the universe was the wet, rhythmic rasp of my own lungs recycling the same cubic meter of air I'd been breathing for 4 hours. It tasted of stale coffee and ionized aluminum. I hung suspended in the void, 300 kilometers above the shimmering blue curve of the Atlantic, tethered to the outer hull of Orbital Penitentiary Station 7 by a braided cable no thicker than my thumb. We called it the Spire. The marketing brochures back on Earth, the ones they gave to the families of the condemned, called it the High Altitude Rehabilitation Center, a place to rise above one's sins, literally. But out here, staring down at the cloud formations swirling like cream in a gravity well, you didn't feel rehabilitated. You felt discarded, like a fleck of dust flicked off the shoulder of a giant.
My mag boots were locked onto a panel of photovoltaic shielding that had taken a micrometeoroid hit. That was the job. EVA maintenance. High-risk labor for low-risk inmates. It bought me extra rations and a view that would have cost a tourist 10 million credits, assuming the tourist didn't mind the constant low-level radiation sickness that tickled the back of your throat. I adjusted the torque on the impact driver. My gloves were stiff, pressurized bladders that fought every movement of my fingers. You had to deliberate every motion. Grip, squeeze, turn, release. It was a somatic meditation. If you panicked, you burned oxygen. If you burned oxygen, the CO2 scrubbers couldn't keep up. Then the headache started. Then the tunnel vision. Then you were just another piece of space junk waiting to burn up on re-entry. I checked the heads-up display projected onto the inside of my helmet. Oxygen at 60%, heart rate steady at 55. A good day. I was about to signal the foreman, a voice in my ear named Officer Miller, who sat comfortably inside the radiation-shielded command deck, when the hull beneath my feet jumped. It wasn't a sound. Sound doesn't travel in a vacuum. It was a kick, a violent structural shudder that traveled up through the soles of my boots, vibrated through my skeleton, and rattled my teeth. The display in my helmet flickered. Red warning glyphs cascaded down the periphery of my vision.
Then the silence broke, not with an explosion, but with the voice of Officer Miller screaming. It was a jagged, clipped sound, cut short by a burst of static that sounded like frying fat. I looked up toward the habitation ring, the rotating torus that provided the gravity for the cell blocks. It wasn't rotating anymore. It was shearing. A plume of white vapor, crystallized instantly into ice, was venting from the main strut. Atmosphere. The station was bleeding. I watched, detached by the lack of sound, as a piece of the docking arm slowly, gracefully, peeled away like the skin of an orange. Debris. That was the first thought. The Kessler Syndrome. One collision creating a cloud of shrapnel that creates more collisions, a chain reaction of kinetic violence. I flattened myself against the solar panel, a futile instinct from a life spent under gravity. Out here, there was no down to duck into. A shard of titanium, spinning like a ninja star, sliced through my safety tether. I felt the snap in my harness. I was adrift. The station, the Spire, was moving away from me. Or I was moving away from it. Newtonian physics is cruel in its indifference. An object in motion stays in motion. I was drifting retrograde, tumbling slowly, watching the only home I had left disintegrate in silent majesty.
Panic is a biological error in space. I forced my breathing to slow. In, out. In, out. I triggered the cold gas thrusters on my maneuvering unit. Just a hiss of nitrogen. I arrested my spin. I stabilized. I was 50 meters off the port bow of the station and drifting further every second. I looked for the others. There were 3 other inmates on the EVA detail. I saw a yellow suit tumbling end over end, limbs flailing. That was Jenkins. He wasn't correcting his spin. The centrifugal force would pool the blood in his head and feet until he passed out. I couldn't reach him. I looked for the airlock. It was gone. The section of the hull where we'd exited was a jagged maw of twisted metal.
But there was something wrong with the debris field. It wasn't chaotic. It was directional. The venting wasn't just a leak. It was thrust. The station wasn't exploding. It was accelerating. I checked the stars. The constellation Orion hung fixed and uncaring, but the Earth below was shifting. The angle of the horizon was changing too fast. The Spire wasn't suffering a structural failure. It was executing a burn, a delta V maneuver. But the engines were offline. They were using the venting atmosphere as a crude rocket. They were deorbiting. I had a choice. Drift here and wait for my oxygen to run out. A peaceful, hypoxic death that would feel like falling asleep in a snowbank. Or try to grab the beast before it ran. I looked at the maintenance hatch near the aft radiators. It was still intact. I checked my nitrogen levels. 8%. Enough for one hard push and a prayer. I aligned my vector. I didn't think about the physics. I let the muscle memory of 10 years as a structural engineer take over. I became a vector. I fired the thrusters. The kick pressed me into the suit. I closed the distance. The station grew in my vision, a wall of gray metal scarred by micrometeors. I was coming in too hot. I didn't have the fuel to brake. I was going to impact. I rotated my body, putting my feet forward, knees bent. I hit the hull. The impact jarred my spine, snapping my head back against the helmet rest. Stars danced in my vision that weren't there a second ago. My mag boots clattered, searching for purchase. They locked. I was on. I was alive. I was a barnacle on a diving whale. I crawled toward the manual override on the maintenance hatch. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. I cranked the wheel. It resisted. The vacuum seal had cold welded shut. I braced my feet and pulled until I felt the tendons in my shoulder scream. With a crack that vibrated through my arms, the seal broke. I spun the wheel, cycled the airlock, and tumbled inside. The pressure equalization hissed, a sound so loud after the silence of the void that it felt like a physical blow. The air in the lock smelled of ozone and burned plastic. I cracked the inner door. The corridor beyond was bathed in emergency strobes, a nauseating pulse of red and black. Gravity was fluctuating, the artificial rotation destabilized by the venting. Down was a suggestion, not a rule. Bodies floated in the hallway. Guards, inmates, it didn't matter. The uniforms were all the same shade of crimson now. There were no gunshot wounds. Their eyes were bloodshot, their mouths open in silent screams. Decompression. Someone had blown the atmosphere in the cell blocks. This wasn't a prison break. This was a liquidation. I pulled myself along the handrails, swimming through the air. I needed to get to the central spine, to the command deck. I needed to know why we were falling. I passed the mess hall. Trays of reconstituted protein paste floated like aggressive geometric art. A boot drifted by, still containing a foot. I pushed it aside. The somatic empathy hit me then, the realization of the sheer biological waste. Thousands of beating hearts, thousands of minds worrying about parole hearings and commissary credits, all snuffing out in a single second of vacuum exposure. I reached the junction to the command spine. The blast door was sealed. I accessed the panel. My clearance code, Inmate Maintenance Class 4, shouldn't have worked, but the system was in fault mode. It accepted the code. The door slid open. Inside, the gravity was stronger, closer to 1G. The command deck was intact, and it was occupied. Not by Warden Kincaid, not by the guards, by inmates. 3 of them. I recognized them from the yard, the Ascendants, a pseudo-religious gang that worshipped the concept of kinetic cleansing. They were huddled around the navigation console, their orange jumpsuits stark against the sleek white interfaces.
One of them, a man named Vorek, who had tattoos of orbital trajectories inked up his neck, turned to look at me. He didn't look angry. He looked serene. He held a modified rivet gun, but he didn't raise it. He gestured to the main view screen. "You're late, engineer," he said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so. "The trajectory is locked. We are the hammer of God."
I looked at the screen. A parabolic arc was traced in red across the map of the Earth. We were crossing the Terminator line, moving from orbital night into day. The friction of the upper atmosphere was already beginning to heat the hull. I could hear the groan of the metal, a low, mournful singing as the heat shields began to ablate. "You're burning up," I said. "The station isn't designed for re-entry. You'll vaporize before you hit the ground." Vorek smiled. "We aren't aiming for the ground. Look at the target."
I squinted at the telemetry. The red line didn't end in the ocean. It didn't end in a city. It ended at a coordinate in the equatorial Pacific, a single stationary point. The anchor, the base station of the Zurich Orbital Space Elevator, the beanstalk, the tether that connected Earth to the economy of the solar system, the single most expensive, most vital piece of infrastructure in human history. If they hit that, the counterweight in geostationary orbit would snap. The cable, 50,000 kilometers of carbon nanotube, would wrap around the Earth like a whip. It wouldn't just be an impact. It would be a global decapitation. Satellites, stations, the internet, the power grid, everything in low Earth orbit would be shredded.
Why? I asked. It was a stupid question. Vorek answered it anyway. To level the playing field, to bring the sky down to the Earth. No more gods in orbit looking down on the insects. He tapped the console. Locked out, encrypted with a dead man's switch. You can't stop it. He was right. The physics were already dictating the ending. We had too much velocity. The atmosphere was grabbing us. The station shook, a violent lurch that threw us all to the deck. The roar of re-entry began, a sound like a freight train screaming in a tunnel.
I looked at the controls. He was right about the lockout. I couldn't abort the descent. I couldn't fire the thrusters to boost us back up. But I was an engineer. I knew structures. I knew where the weak points were. I knew that the Spire was built in modular sections, held together by magnetic clamps. If I couldn't stop the bullet, maybe I could shatter it before it hit the target. "You want to be a hammer?" I said. I crawled toward the engineering station, fighting the G-forces that were pressing me into the floor like a giant hand. "Let's see how you handle being shrapnel."
Vorek raised the rivet gun. "Don't," he warned. The ship groaned again, louder this time. The temperature in the room was rising. I could smell the plastic of the console starting to melt. "It's already done," I lied. My fingers flew across the tactile interface. I wasn't accessing the navigation. I was accessing the environmental controls, specifically the thermal regulation system for the magnetic clamps holding the command module to the habitation ring. "What are you doing?" Vorek shouted, his serenity cracking as the floor tilted 15 degrees. "Thermal runaway," I grunted. "I'm dumping the coolant from the magnetic couplings." I hit execute. Somewhere deep in the guts of the station, supercooled helium vented into the superheated plasma of re-entry. The thermal shock would be instantaneous. Metal would shatter like glass. Vorek fired. The rivet struck my shoulder, punching through the suit, shattering my clavicle. The pain was white and blinding, a supernova in my nervous system. I slumped over the console, gasping, tasting blood.
But I felt it. The snap, louder than the first one. The command module, the tip of the spear, broke free from the massive mass of the habitation ring. We were no longer one heavy kinetic impactor. We were two. And without the mass of the ring behind us, the aerodynamics changed. The command module tumbled. The habitation ring, with its thousands of dead, spun away, caught by the atmospheric drag, breaking apart into a meteor shower of burning debris.
The target solution on the screen fractured. The red line disappeared, replaced by a cone of uncertainty that spanned half the Pacific Ocean. We missed. We were going to miss the elevator. We weren't going to break the world. We were just going to burn. Vorek stared at the screen, the rivet gun slipping from his hand. He looked small now, just a man in a melting room.
The roar was deafening now. The viewport was a sheet of white fire. Gravity was crushing me, pinning me to the console. My vision tunneled. I thought of the brochure, high-altitude rehabilitation. I thought of the irony. I had successfully dismantled the prison system. I closed my eyes. The pain in my shoulder faded into the background noise of the heat and the vibration. There was no fear left, only the physics, the absolute, impartial justice, of friction and heat. I took a breath. It tasted of smoke and finality. We fell.